November 10th, 1947, 7:29 a.m. The courtyard is frozen. A thin mist clings to the cobblestones of a military barracks in Charleroi, Belgium. Soldiers stand in two straight lines, rifles loaded, faces blank. A priest clutches his Bible with both hands, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. From inside a stone corridor comes a sound that cuts through the silence like a knife. Screaming. Not the dignified last cry of a soldier. Not defiance. Just raw animal terror. The sound of a man who knows with absolute certainty that the next few minutes will be his last on earth. Two guards appear, dragging a skeletal figure between them. His legs have stopped working entirely. His coat hangs off him like it belongs to someone else. His eyes are red and swollen. He is 32 years old. His name is Louis Collard, and the 27 Belgian civilians he ordered to their deaths 3 years ago, the teachers, the shopkeepers, the priest, the mothers, they cannot scream anymore.
He can, but it won't help. This is the true story of a man who chose power over conscience, climbed to the top of a criminal empire built on collaboration and terror, and paid the price in front of a firing squad on a cold Belgian morning. If you are watching Nazi history profiles for the first time, welcome. We tell the stories that most history channels are afraid to touch. The collaborators, the war criminals, the men and women who looked at Nazi occupation and saw opportunity instead of horror. Subscribe right now, hit the bell, and stay with us, because this story gets darker before it ends. To understand Louis Collard, you first need to understand what happened to Belgium in the spring of 1940, because the collapse of an entire nation is what gave men like him their opening. May 10th, 1940. German forces launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of Western Europe.
While the world expected a frontal assault through northern Belgium, Nazi armored columns knifed through the Ardennes forest, a route Allied commanders had genuinely believed was impassable for tanks. It wasn't. Within 72 hours, the entire Allied defensive line began to buckle. Within 18 days, it was finished. On May 28, 1940, King Leopold III surrendered the Belgian army. Roughly 200,000 Belgian soldiers laid down their weapons. The swastika rose above the royal palace in Brussels. The occupation had begun. What followed was methodical and suffocating. The Nazi administration dissolved political parties, shut down the free press, and began flooding Belgian society with propaganda in both French and Flemish. Food was rationed. Curfews were enforced. The Gestapo set up offices on quiet Belgian streets. And the occupiers began their most important recruitment drive, finding locals smart enough, ambitious enough, and ideologically committed enough to help them run the country they had just stolen. They found exactly what they were looking for. Louis Collard was born on August 1915 in Anse-de-Fif. In Anse-de-Fils, a gritty working-class industrial town in the French-speaking Wallonia region of Belgium. He grew up in a country still healing from the First World War, still carrying the psychological wounds of a previous German occupation. Unemployment was high. Social instability was a daily reality. And across Europe, a generation of young men raised on humiliation and economic despair were being drawn toward radical movements that promised order, power, and purpose. For Collard, that movement was Rex. Rex, short for Christus Rex, Latin for Christ the King, had begun its life in 1930 as a Catholic publishing house run by one of the most magnetic and dangerous political figures Belgium ever produced, Léon Degrelle.
By the mid-1930s, Degrelle had transformed his small publishing group into a full political party, authoritarian, nationalist, violently anti-communist, and deeply inspired by the fascism of Mussolini and Hitler. In 1936, Rex stunned the country by winning 11.5% of the national vote, sending 21 deputies into the Belgian parliament. But here is what most people don't know. Rex was also deeply social in its culture. It organized rallies that felt like revivals. It published newspapers. It created a sense of community, a tribe for young men who felt left behind by the old Belgium. And it was within this world that Louis Collard found both his political identity and, eventually, the woman who would stand beside him until the very end. Her name was Huguette. We know frustratingly little about her. History, as usual, has recorded far more about the powerful men than the women who loved them. But Huguette was real, and her loyalty to Collard was total.
When he fled Belgium as the Allies advanced, she went with him. When he hid in the Austrian Alps, she hid too. When Belgian intelligence finally tracked him down in Innsbruck in February 1946, Huguette was beside him in that cold apartment, living like a fugitive, refusing to leave the man she had married, even as the walls closed in around them both. It is one of the most haunting ironies of the story. The man responsible for so much suffering was himself loved, genuinely, devotedly loved by at least one person, and none of it could save him. Under Nazi occupation, Degrelle reorganized Rex as an instrument of German authority. Collard, already known inside the movement for his sharp organizational mind and iron discipline, rose quickly. By 1941, he was overseeing propaganda operations and internal coordination for Rex across occupied Belgium. His most consequential relationships were not with other Belgians, they were with the Germans.
Collard cultivated deep working ties with the SD, Orbi, the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi Party's intelligence arm, and with the Gestapo, the secret state police responsible for crushing political opposition across occupied Europe. These were not casual connections. Collard became a trusted operational partner of the German security apparatus. He fed them names. He built informant networks. He helped identify resistance members, Jews, Freemasons, and political opponents for arrest, deportation, and worse. When Degrelle left Belgium in 1943 to join the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front, chasing military glory in the carnage of the Soviet campaigns, Collard effectively became the most powerful Rexist in Belgium. Operating from offices in both Brussels and Charleroi, he commanded a movement that had transformed itself from a political party into a paramilitary instrument of Nazi control. At the center of that transformation was Brigade B, also called Formation B, Collard's personal paramilitary unit. Night raids, surveillance networks, arrests, violence. Brigade B operated with the confidence of men who believed they were on the permanent winning side of history. They were not. By the summer of 1944, the Third Reich was bleeding from every direction. The Normandy landings in June had opened the Western Front. The Red Army was advancing from the east. Inside Belgium, the resistance was growing bolder by the week. Ambushes, assassinations, sabotage of German supply lines. The collaborators were panicking. August 17, 1944. Resistance fighters ambushed a convoy in Charleroi and killed Oswald Engelbane, the Rexist mayor of Charleroi, along with his wife and their son. The attack was brutal and precise, and it sent shockwaves through the Rexist leadership. What happened next was not justice. It was not military necessity. It was pure, uncontrolled rage dressed up as reprisal.
Within hours of Engelbane's death, Collard and Victor Matthys, the acting national leader of Rex, gave the order. Go into Courcelles, grab civilians, make an example. Rexist militiamen fanned out through the town that evening. They pulled people from their homes without warrants, without evidence, without any legal process whatsoever. The sweep collected teachers, shopkeepers, local officials, union members, and a Catholic priest. Men who had nothing to do with the resistance. Men whose only crime was living in the wrong town at the wrong moment. Several were shot that same night. The rest were held through the dark, terrifying hours before dawn. On the morning of August 18th, 1944, the surviving prisoners were led to a wall in groups and executed by firing squad. When the shooting stopped, 27 Belgian civilians were dead. Eyewitnesses later placed Collard at the center of the operation, giving commands, directing the militiamen, personally overseeing the slaughter of his own countrymen. He was not a bystander. He was in charge.
It was the single worst atrocity committed by Belgian collaborators during the entire occupation, and it happened just 23 days before Allied forces liberated Belgium. 23 days. If Collard had simply waited, history might have swallowed him differently. He could not wait. On September 4th, 1944, British and American forces entered Brussels. The occupation was over. Rex disintegrated overnight. Degrelle fled to Germany aboard a private plane and eventually reached Spain, where dictator Francisco Franco granted him asylum. He would live there in comfort until 1994, one of the great unpunished war criminals of the 20th century. Collard chose a different path.
I have only chaotic fragments of memory. When a witness testified to watching him carry petrol cans and personally set houses on fire, Collard smirked and replied, "I do not remember, but I recall there were at least 15 people with me, and I did everything myself, did I? What were the others doing then?" The courtroom was not impressed. 147 witnesses testified over 2 months. Former Rexists turned on him, and a leading saboteur, Jean Novaire, told the court under oath that Collard had personally ordered him to compile intelligence on Belgian Freemasons, a list that fed directly into the assassination of Jules Haynau, a prominent university director and politician. When confronted with this testimony, Collard stopped smirking. He quietly admitted he had taken responsibility for certain reprisals, such as the Courcelles massacre of August 18th. Reprisals. That was the word he chose for 27 dead civilians. On August 3rd, 1946, the Charleroi War Council delivered its verdict.
Both Matthys and Collard were sentenced to death by firing squad. That night, alone in his cell, Louis Collard attempted suicide. He survived, but the man who walked out of that courtroom was no longer the arrogant, smirking figure who had tried to memory loss his way through 2 months of testimony. He was broken. November 10th, 1947, the barracks courtyard in Charleroi. 27 Rexist collaborators were scheduled to die that morning, one for each civilian killed at Courcelles. The symmetry was deliberate and devastating. Belgian justice had decided that the number of executions would match the number of victims exactly. Collard was in the first group, scheduled for 7:30 a.m. He could not walk. Guards physically carried him across the frozen courtyard to the execution post. He wept openly. He screamed. He begged for his life with the same desperation that 27 civilians must have felt 3 years earlier. Civilians who had no one to beg, no one to plead to, no one who would listen. Military protocol required a formal degradation ceremony before the execution.
The insignia were ripped from his coat in front of the assembled soldiers. The charges were read aloud in the cold morning air. War crimes, assassination, massacre, collaboration with the enemy. A priest stepped forward and offered last rites. Collard gripped the man's hand. He wept through the prayer, repeating words quietly, his lips trembling. The priest made the sign of the cross. Then the red targeting cloth was pinned to Collard's chest. The commanding officer raised his sword. At exactly 7:36 a.m., the rifles fired. Collard slumped forward, but he did not die immediately. His body convulsed.
He was still screaming. The priest moved in and administered final absolution. A gendarmerie officer stepped forward, drew his service pistol, and fired a single bullet into Collard's skull. The coup de grace. Silence returned to the courtyard. 27 people had been murdered at Courcelles. 27 people had been murdered at Courcelles. Louis Collard, the intelligence man, the propagandist, the Brigade B commander, the man who had stood at that wall in the early hours of August 18th, 1944, and given the order, was the first to fall. He was 32 years old.
History does not forget. It may be slow, it may seem uncertain, but in the end, the names find their way into the record, both the victims and the men who put them in the ground. Louis Collard made his choices. He chose ideology over humanity. He chose collaboration over conscience. He chose power over the lives of the people he was supposed to share a country with. And on a cold November morning in 1947, those choices were answered. If this video gave you something, a fact you didn't know, a story that stayed with you, subscribe to Nazi History Profiles right now. This channel exists to make sure stories like this are never buried. Hit like, leave a comment. Tell us which collaborator, war criminal, or forgotten historical figure you want us to cover next. Every comment and every subscription keeps this work alive. We'll see you in the next one.